The rough ropes burned my wrists. No phone, no way out of this cellar. Damien stood there staring at me like I was nothing but a transaction. You were just the fastest way to pay off my debt. He was not breaking my heart. He was balancing his books. He actually sold me. But as the buyer stepped out of the shadows, the heavy silence dropped. His cold eyes locked onto the silver griffin medallion resting against my skin, and he completely froze. Just 4 days ago, the cold dampness of this cellar did not exist in my world. 4 days ago, Damien was holding my hands across a candlelit table in our favorite restaurant. His eyes were so warm, his voice dripping with promises that I desperately wanted to believe. "I have a surprise for us," he whispered, pulling out 2 first-class tickets. "We are going to the Mediterranean coast. Just you and me. We are finally going to start that life we always talked about." I looked at those tickets and saw a beautiful future. I saw a man who loved me enough to take me away from the crushing exhaustion of my daily routine. I was so tired back then, so ready to let someone else take the wheel, and Damien knew exactly how to play the role of the perfect savior. People always ask the same question when they hear stories like mine. Why didn't you see the red flags? Why didn't you run while you still could? But the truth is, the most lethal trap in the world never starts with danger. It starts with a profound, overwhelming feeling of safety. A predator does not show you his teeth when he wants to draw you in. He shows you a warm fire and a place to rest. You do not question the walls of a fortress when you believe they are built to protect you from the storm outside. You only realize the terrifying truth when the storm passes, and you hear the locks click shut from the outside. Damien did not overpower me with force. He systematically dismantled my survival instincts, using love as his anesthetic. Looking back, every single detail of that romantic getaway was a brilliantly calculated blueprint, a step-by-step design to completely erase my existence. The manipulation started before we even packed our bags. He casually offered to consolidate our finances for the trip. "Let me transfer your savings into my premium account so we avoid the international fees," he had said, kissing my forehead. I handed over my financial independence without a single doubt. When we arrived at the airport, he smiled that familiar, comforting smile and held out his hand. "Let me keep your passport and ID safe in my secure folder, so you do not have to stress about losing them." I gave him my identity, and when my phone buzzed with a message from my friend, he gently took the device from my fingers and powered it down. "Let us just be present. No distractions, no outside world, just you and me." I thought it was peak romance. I thought he just wanted my undivided attention. I had no idea he was surgically cutting every single wire that connected me to the outside world. He was isolating his asset. The flight felt like a dream. But the second we landed on European soil, the carefully rehearsed script began to fracture. The private car he hired did not head towards the luxury resort he had shown me in the glossy brochures. Instead, we drove for hours in the opposite direction. The bright, welcoming city lights quickly faded into dark, winding, desolate coastal roads. The silence inside the car grew heavier with every mile. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked, a cold shadow of unease finally creeping into my chest. He did not look at me. His eyes were locked dead ahead on the road, his jaw tight. Just a change of plans. A private villa, much more exclusive. The warmth in his voice was completely gone, replaced by something cold, something utterly mechanical. When we finally pulled up to the isolated coastal villa, the ocean air tasted bitter and heavy. The moment we stepped inside the dim hallway, his hand closed around my wrist. The grip changed. It was no longer the guiding touch of a lover. It was the firm, unyielding hold of a warden. And he dragged me down the stairs, pushing me roughly into this damp, windowless cellar. The heavy iron door slammed shut. The metallic clang vibrated through my teeth, shattering my fragile dream into a million jagged pieces. He had never planned a future for us. He had spent the last 6 months calculating my market value. The romantic trip of a lifetime was nothing but a scheduled delivery. My knees hit the damp concrete. I looked up at the man I had loved for 2 years, desperately trying to find a trace of a joke, a mistake, anything. Damien? Why? My voice was barely a whisper, choking on the freezing air of the cellar. He did not flinch. He did not look away in shame. Instead, he just let out a heavy, irritated sigh, rolling his sleeve to check the silver watch I had bought him for his last birthday. "Keep your voice down, Lena," he muttered, stepping closer to the tall figure standing in the shadows. "Do not make a scene. We are in the middle of a transaction." A transaction? That single word echoed in my head until it felt like it would split my skull open. I pulled against the rough ropes binding my wrists. I stared into his dark eyes, searching for the man who used to hold me when I had a bad day. He was completely gone. The look he gave me now was not anger. It was not even hatred. It was something far more terrifying. He was looking at me exactly the way a broker looks at a spreadsheet, like an asset, a commodity with a fixed market value. "You promised me a future," I screamed, the sound bouncing violently off the stone walls. "You looked me in the eye and said we were going to build a life together." He paused, rubbing his temples as if I were nothing more than a minor headache ruining his afternoon. He finally turned to me, his jaw clenching in pure annoyance. "I never lied, Lena. I really am building a better life. I just never said that future included you. You were always just a stepping stone, and a very profitable one." My chest caved in. That is the true, paralyzing horror of a master manipulator. They do not need to invent elaborate, convoluted lies. They do not have to fabricate entirely new realities. They just need to tell you exactly enough of the truth so you never, ever suspect the trap. He wanted wealth. He wanted freedom. He wanted luxury. He told me all of that. I just blindly assumed we were sharing that dream, when in reality, I was the currency he planned to use to pay for it. The man in the shadows, the buyer, took a slow step forward. His heavy boots echoed like a countdown. Damien immediately straightened his posture, eager to please. "She is in perfect condition, sir," Damien said smoothly, gesturing towards me like a used car salesman. "No family ties that will cause trouble, completely isolated. You will not find a cleaner slate on the market." I stopped crying. The tears literally froze in my eyes. The sheer calculated cruelty of his words burned away my grief, leaving behind a cold, hollow space. I was not a person to him anymore. I was simply the fastest way to clear his debts. The buyer ignored Damien entirely. He stepped into the dim overhead light, his sharp gaze sweeping over me. But as he looked down, his eyes suddenly stopped. He did not look at my face. He was not looking at the ropes. And his cold stare was completely locked onto my chest, right where my collar pulled back, exposing the silver griffin medallion resting against my skin. The cellar was so incredibly quiet. I could literally hear the frantic beating of my own heart echoing against the concrete walls. The man they called Victor did not move a single muscle. His breathing seemed to stop completely. His cold, predatory eyes were entirely fixated on the small, tarnished silver griffin medallion resting right above my collarbone. The suffocating tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Damien shifted his weight, clearly agitated by the sudden dead silence. He nervously cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the transaction. "Look, if the jewelry is an issue, I can just rip it off her," Damien muttered. Or taking a step toward me with his hand outstretched. "Do not even breathe on her," Victor roared, his voice exploding like a gunshot in the confined space. Damien physically recoiled, stumbling backward as if he had just been struck in the chest. The smug, calculating arrogance melted off his face in a fraction of a second. Victor slowly stepped toward me. The entire atmosphere of the room violently shifted. Just moments ago, his gaze was stripping me down, evaluating me as a piece of cheap merchandise. But now, he was looking at me with something else. It was not just hesitation, it was absolute paralyzing fear. He carefully leaned in, his eyes wide, studying the intricate carvings on the silver metal. "Where did you get this?" Victor asked, his voice dropping into a hoarse, trembling whisper. He slowly reached out his hand, but he stopped a full inch away from my skin. He did not dare touch the medallion. It was as if the necklace was made of burning coals, and he was terrified of getting burned. "It was my mother's," I answered, my throat bone dry. "She gave it to me. It has been in our family forever." Victor swallowed hard, the color completely drained from his rugged face. He took a slow, deliberate step back, and then, to my utter shock, he lowered his head in a deep, formal bow. "Miss Hart." I had absolutely no idea. "Please forgive my profound disrespect," he said, his tone entirely stripped of its previous malice. Damien let out a high-pitched, panicked laugh. He looked wildly between me and Victor, completely losing his mind. "Victor, what the hell are you doing? She is nobody. She is just a regular girl from the city. I brought her here for the deal. We agreed on 500 grand. Victor slowly turned his head to look at my ex-boyfriend. The fear in Victor's eyes instantly morphed into pure, lethal disgust. "You ignorant fool," Victor said softly, his voice dripping with venom. "You brought me the sole bloodline of the Hart Empire. You put a price tag on a woman that nobody on this earth is allowed to touch." Damien's knees literally gave out. He collapsed onto the damp floor, staring up at me as if I had just turned into a monster. The man who had meticulously calculated my worth, the man who had sold me to clear his debts, was now shaking uncontrollably. "Lena. Lena, please tell him we are in love. Tell him this is a misunderstanding," he begged, his voice cracking with pathetic, raw desperation. I stood there in the freezing basement, the rough rope still burning my wrists. But I was no longer a victim. The entire power structure of the room had just flipped in the blink of an eye. In this ruthless, hidden world, your true identity is infinitely more powerful than any weapon. A simple piece of silver had just brought a terrifying criminal to his knees. As I looked down at Damien's trembling body, a massive, terrifying question exploded in my mind. Who exactly was the woman I called my mother? The deafening roar of the helicopter blades violently shook the ground. I was no longer a captive. Victor personally escorted me out of that rotting cellar, his head deeply bowed, his men forming an impenetrable human shield around me. We flew through the pitch-black night, not towards an embassy, not towards a police station, but towards a massive, fortress-like estate carved into the highest cliff of the coastline. As we landed on the private helipad, the icy wind whipped my hair across my face. I stumbled out, my legs still trembling from the hours tied to that concrete floor. But what I saw made my breath completely catch in my throat. This was not a house. It was a military compound brilliantly disguised as a luxury mansion. Men in black tactical gear with assault rifles patrolled the perimeter. High-tech security cameras tracked my every single movement, their red lights blinking in the dark. Huge steel gates locked shut behind us with a heavy, terrifying metallic thud. Victor walked beside me in complete silence. He led me through grand, cold marble corridors, past priceless artwork and guards who immediately stood at absolute attention as we passed. We finally stopped in front of two massive, intricately carved oak doors. He did not knock. He simply opened them, stepped aside, and lowered his gaze to the floor. I walked into the dimly lit, cavernous study, and my heart completely stopped. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, surrounded by glowing monitors and stacks of classified dossiers, was a woman I had known for my entire life. Catherine Hart, my mother. My legs felt like lead. I could barely take another step forward. This was not the woman I remembered. The mother I grew up with was quiet, distant, always complaining about her boring corporate job in the mundane suburban neighborhood. I thought I knew everything about her, but the woman sitting in that high-backed leather chair did not look like a mother at all. She looked like a supreme commander ruling over a ruthless, hidden empire. She was wearing a perfectly tailored black suit, her posture rigid, her eyes cold, calculating, and sharper than shattered glass. She did not gasp when she saw me. She did not rush across the room to hold me. She did not shed a single tear for her daughter who had just been sold into human trafficking. She simply leaned back in her chair and stared at me. Her gaze swept over my bruised wrists, my torn clothes, and finally rested on the silver griffin medallion hanging from my neck. She was not looking at me with love. She was evaluating me. A terrifying, paralyzing realization washed over me. My entire childhood, my completely normal, boring life. It was all a meticulously engineered lie. Some families do not lie to you. They simply never tell you the whole truth. They lock you inside a perfectly safe, artificial bubble, letting you believe the world is simple, because the reality of who they are is far too dangerous for you to handle. She slowly placed her silver fountain pen down on the desk. The silence in the room was absolutely crushing. "You survived," she finally said. Her voice was perfectly steady, completely stripped of any maternal warmth or relief. It sounded like a general acknowledging a soldier who had just returned from a bloody battlefield. I swallowed hard, the air suddenly feeling way too thin to breathe. I had just spent 3 days terrified of monsters hiding in the dark, only to realize I was raised by the person who controlled them all. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking with a mixture of betrayal and raw fear. She stood up, her presence instantly dominating the entire room. "I am the reason you are still breathing, Lena," she replied coldly. "Now sit down. We have a lot of work to do." I stood in the center of the cavernous study, shivering in my torn clothes, desperately waiting for her to break. I waited for the terrifying facade of the Supreme Commander to shatter. I waited for her to rush around that massive mahogany desk, pull me into her arms, and tell me that the nightmare was finally over. I had just survived 3 days in a freezing, windowless cellar. I had just been auctioned off by the man I thought I was going to marry. My soul was completely bruised, and I just needed my mother. But Catherine Hart did not move a single inch. She remained perfectly still in her high-backed leather chair, her hands steepled together. And she did not look at me with sympathy. She looked at me with clinical precision. Her cold eyes scanned my trembling hands, the dark bruises forming around my wrists, and the tear stains on my cheeks. She was dissecting me like a medical specimen, searching for structural flaws. "Are you not even going to hug me?" I whispered, my voice cracking under the crushing weight of the silence. Catherine let out a slow, measured breath. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. "A hug will not stop a bullet, Lena," she replied evenly, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "And right now, sentimentality is a highly dangerous luxury that neither of us can afford." I stared at her in absolute shock. A surge of desperate anger flared up in my chest. "I almost died today. I am your daughter, and that makes you a walking weakness." She snapped back, her voice suddenly cracking through the room like a whip. "You are a glaring, exposed target in a world you do not even begin to understand." She stood up, her commanding presence casting a long, intimidating shadow across the floor. She walked around the desk, her footsteps echoing sharply against the marble floor. "Look at yourself, Lena," she continued, her tone dropping into a chilling, razor-sharp calm. "You let a mid-level, desperate con artist manipulate your finances, isolate you from your friends, and put a literal price tag on your head. And why? Because he smiled nicely and bought you dinner. Because he painted a pretty little picture of a European vacation. You walked right into a slaughterhouse with a smile on your face." Her words hit me harder than the cold concrete floor of that basement, and they were brutally cruel. But the truly terrifying part was that every single word was completely true. "I thought I was giving you a gift," Catherine said, stopping just a few feet away from me. "I built a perfectly normal, quiet, boring life for you. I kept you completely separated from the blood, the ruthless betrayals, and the absolute monsters that built this empire. I genuinely thought that keeping you ignorant would keep you safe, but I miscalculated. Overprotecting you did not eliminate the danger in this world. It just created a girl who does not even know when to be afraid." I swallowed hard, tasting the bitter salt of my own tears. "You were a lamb walking among wolves, Lena, and you could not even smell the blood on their teeth," she whispered. My chest tightened painfully. Every time I scraped my knee as a child, she was never the one to coddle me or dry my tears. She always just told me to stand up. I finally understood why. In her world, in this dark, unforgiving reality, love is not about shielding you from the pain. Shielding you makes you soft. True love, in the world of true power, is forcing you to be strong enough to survive the killing blow. She turned her back to me and stared out the massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the dark, turbulent ocean. "I am giving you a choice, and I will only offer this to you once." She pointed a single finger toward the heavy oak doors. "Option 1. You walk out of those doors right now. My men will put you on a plane to a safe location. I will give you a completely new identity, a new face, and enough money to disappear forever. You can go back to being ordinary. You will be entirely safe. But you will never see me again, and you will never, ever know the truth about who you are." She slowly turned back around, her sharp eyes piercing straight through my soul. "Option 2, you stay. But if you stay, there is no more hiding behind my shadow. You will have to learn exactly how this family operates. You will have to pay the price in blood, sweat, and extreme pain to understand the mechanics of this world. And I promise you, Lena, it will completely break you down before it builds you back up." The silence in the study became deafening again. My entire body was aching, begging me to take the money and run as far away as humanly possible. A normal, sane person would run. But as I reached up and touched the cold, heavy silver of the Griffin medallion resting against my collarbone, something fundamental and irreversible shifted inside my mind. Damien had nearly destroyed me because I was blind to the game. I refused to ever be blind again. I looked straight into my mother's terrifying eyes, my voice finally steady. "I am not leaving. I want to learn how to play." My legs could barely carry me as I walked out of those massive oak doors. The cavernous marble corridors of the estate felt like an absolute tomb. My mother had just shattered my entire reality, offering me a world of blood and power instead of the comfort I was desperately begging for. I felt completely hollow, stripped of everything I thought I knew. I just needed one familiar face. One single thread of my old, normal life to hold on to before I completely fell apart. And then I saw him walking toward me under the dim hallway lights. Arthur. Arthur Hale had been my mother's chief of staff and closest advisor for over 20 years. But to me, he was just Uncle Arthur. When my mother missed my school plays because of an emergency board meeting, Arthur was the one sitting in the front row. When I scraped my knees falling off my bike, my mother would tell me to get back up, but Arthur was the one who brought the bandages and the hot chocolate. He was the warmth in a profoundly cold house. "Lena? My God, you are safe," he breathed out, rushing forward and wrapping his arms tightly around my shoulders. I collapsed into his chest, burying my face in his coat. For the first time in 3 days, I felt a genuine wave of safety wash over me. "I was terrified we had lost you," he whispered, gently stroking my hair. "When the security team intercepted the signal, and I told them to scramble the jets immediately. That damp cellar in the coastal villa could have flooded before Victor even arrived." I stopped breathing. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. I kept my face pressed against his coat, my eyes wide open in the dark. My mother's security team did not know where I was held. During the debrief in the study, my mother explicitly said they were still tracking Damien's phone in the city center. Victor found me by accident because of a black market tip. There was absolutely no mention of a coastal villa. There was no mention of a cellar. The only people on this earth who knew about that specific location were Damien, the buyer, and the person who orchestrated the entire trap. I slowly pushed myself away from his chest. The hallway suddenly felt freezing. "How do you know it was a coastal villa, Arthur?" I asked. He froze. The gentle hands resting on my shoulders suddenly went completely stiff. He looked at me, and for a fraction of a second I saw the machinery turning behind his eyes. "I read the preliminary field report, Lena," he said smoothly. "There is no field report yet." I whispered, taking another step back. "Victor just brought me in." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I have ever experienced. It was heavier than the iron door of the basement. Arthur did not try to backtrack. He did not try to invent another lie. The warm, grandfatherly wrinkles around his eyes simply vanished. His posture straightened, and the comforting old man I had loved for 20 years completely disappeared. The man standing in front of me now was a cold, calculating apex predator. "You always were too observant for your own good," he sighed, casually brushing a speck of dust off his perfectly tailored sleeve. You hired Damien," I choked out, my throat burning. "You sold me." "He was incredibly cheap, Lena. A man drowning in debt is the easiest tool to manipulate," Arthur replied. His voice was no longer warm. It was clinical. "Why? You were family. Because you are a fatal liability to this empire," Arthur snapped, his voice echoing sharply off the stone walls. "Your mother built a dynasty with absolute terrifying ruthlessness, but she has one fatal flaw: you." I watched her hesitate on a multi-billion-dollar acquisition just because you had the flu. I watched her compromise our security to keep your pathetic, normal life intact. I shook my head, tears of pure agony blurring my vision. "I had to remove you from the board," Arthur continued, taking a slow step toward me, "and I knew exactly how to do it. You were always so desperate for affection, Lena. Because your mother never hugged you, you fell for the first mediocre man who bought you flowers. I did not force you into that cellar. I just gave you the map and you walked in there yourself." My knees threatened to give out. The betrayal from Damien was a brutal punch to the gut. But this was a surgical blade sliding directly into my heart. Arthur leaned in close, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "I was the one who told Damien to take your phone. I was the one who told him to promise you Paris. Because I know you, little bird. I know every single one of your pathetic dreams." He turned around and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the freezing corridor. At that exact moment, the final piece of my innocence shattered. A stranger, an enemy from the outside, has to break down your heavy iron gates to destroy you. They have to fight through your armor. But the people you love, the people you trust completely, they do not need to break the door down. They already have the keys to your house. They just have to walk right into your room, smile at you, and turn the blade. The echo of Arthur's footsteps faded into the dead silence of the stone corridor. I stood there completely paralyzed. I stared at the empty space where the only father figure I ever knew had just shattered my entire reality. My hands were shaking so violently I had to press them flat against the freezing marble wall just to keep my legs from collapsing. First Damien, and now Arthur. The two men who were supposed to cherish me, to protect me from the cruelty of the world, had meticulously calculated my exact worth and sold me to the highest bidder. For my entire life, I genuinely believed I was living in a safe, perfectly normal world, a quiet reality where monsters only existed in the dark and bad things only happened to other people. But that world was nothing but a fragile glass box. It was a beautifully painted cage my mother had built, not to protect me, but to keep me completely blind to the truth. I slowly slid down the wall until I hit the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, struggling to pull air into my burning lungs. I thought that simply surviving that terrifying cellar meant I was finally safe. I thought the nightmare was over because I was no longer tied to a concrete floor. But the cold, agonizing realization hit me like a sledgehammer. Escaping the immediate danger does not mean you are safe. It simply means you survived just long enough to blindly walk into the very next trap. As long as I remained ignorant, I would always be the prey. I looked down at the dark bruises wrapping around my wrists. I could still choose the first option. I could walk out of those massive steel gates right now, take my mother's money, and disappear into another comfortable lie. I could go back to being the naive, sweet girl who smiles politely and trusts the people she loves. But the mere thought of going back to that ignorance made my stomach completely churn with pure disgust. If I ran away, I would spend the rest of my breathing life looking over my shoulder, jumping at every shadow. I completely terrified of a game I did not even know was being played. I refused to let some unseen enemy hold the strings to my life ever again. I pressed my palms against the cold floor and forced myself to stand up. The terrified, heartbroken girl who cried for help in that basement, she died in this freezing hallway. I wiped the tears from my face, turned around, and walked straight back to the heavy oak doors. I did not hesitate. I pushed them open. My mother was still standing by the window, exactly where I left her. She slowly turned her head, her sharp eyes locking onto mine. "I am not taking the money," I said, my voice completely steady, echoing across the cavernous room. "I do not want to be saved anymore. I do not want to hide while people like Arthur decide whether I get to live or die. And teach me how to read the board. Teach me the rules of the game." The very next morning, the brutal reality of my choice began. My mother didn't teach me to be strong with comforting words. She taught me with bruises. At 5 a.m, the heavy doors of the estate's underground gym swung open. Victor stood there, tossing a pair of worn training gloves onto the cold mat. "Put them on," he ordered. I was still exhausted, my wrists still aching from the ropes. But I did not complain. I stepped onto the mat. For the first 2 weeks, I did not land a single punch. Victor threw me to the ground over and over again. "Get up!" he barked, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "The enemy does not care if you are tired. The enemy does not care if your heart is broken." My muscles screamed in absolute agony. My lungs burned for air. But every single time I hit the floor, my mind flashed back to that damp cellar. I saw Damien checking his watch, calculating his profit. I saw Arthur's warm, grandfatherly smile as he confessed to selling me to the highest bidder. That burning anger became my adrenaline. I pushed myself up. Again. I gasped, wiping the blood from my lip. I learned how to fall without breaking. I learned how to disarm a man twice my size by using his own momentum against him. I learned that physical pain is just a signal, and you can choose to completely ignore it. But the physical torment was actually the easiest part of my transformation. The real battlefield was in the study with my mother. Every night she dropped massive confidential dossiers onto the mahogany desk. "Read the financial flow," she commanded, tapping a perfectly manicured finger against a corporate ledger. "Where is the lie?" I spent agonizing hours tracking shell companies, offshore accounts, and shadow investments. She forced me to watch hours of silent security footage from high-level board meetings. "Look at his hands," she instructed, pointing at a CEO on the screen. He is leaning forward, dominating the space, but his thumbs are tucked inside his fists. He is terrified. Never confuse aggressive posturing with actual power. I realized how incredibly blind I had been my entire life. I had walked through the world believing people meant exactly what they said. Damien bought me flowers, so I believed he loved me. Arthur attended my school plays, so I believed he protected me. I was a prime target because I evaluated people based on my own desperate emotions, not their calculated actions. My mother systematically dismantled every single illusion I had left. "You do not survive in this world by simply being a good fighter, Lena," she said one evening, pouring a glass of dark scotch. "You survive by reading the board better than anyone else in the room. A manipulator only wins if you willingly follow their breadcrumbs. True strength is not about overpowering someone in a grand cinematic battle. True strength is the absolute refusal to be led in the dark. It is looking a smiling face directly in the eyes and calculating the exact price tag they have placed on your back." Months slowly bled together. I stopped recognizing the girl in the mirror, the soft, naive woman who thought love was enough to survive a cruel world. She was completely dead. My hands were calloused from the heavy bags. My posture shifted. When I walked into a room now, I did not look for a familiar face to cling to. I looked for the exits. I evaluated the sightlines. I scanned the body language of every single guard in the perimeter. I was no longer a piece of merchandise waiting to be traded. I finally understood the rules of the game. I was ready. But the universe has a cruel sense of humor. Just when you think you have armored yourself against every possible angle of attack, the enemy changes the target. I was standing in the training room, wrapping my hands, when the heavy steel doors violently smashed open. Victor rushed in, his usual stoic composure completely shattered. He was breathing heavily, holding a cracked, blood-stained cell phone in his hand. "Miss Lena," he choked out, handing me the device. I looked at the cracked screen, and my heart instantly completely stopped. It was a picture of Mia, my best friend, the only pure, innocent piece of my old life that I had left. She was tied to a chair in a dark industrial room, a gun pressed directly against her temple. "They know you are no longer the same girl," Victor whispered. "Gideon Blackwell's cartel took her. They are trying to force you back into the open." I stared at the cracked screen of the burner phone. The air in the training room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I was looking directly at Mia. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated terror, staring into the camera lens. Her hands were brutally bound to a metal chair with thick zip ties, and the cold steel barrel of a handgun was pressed aggressively against her right temple. Gideon Blackwell. And he was the ruthless head of the syndicate, currently trying to swallow my mother's territory. He could not breach the heavy steel gates of our hillside estate, so he found the absolute weakest link in my armor. He went back into the quiet, boring, suburban world I had left behind, and he ripped my best friend right out of it. Victor stood completely rigid next to me, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the old Lena to resurface. 6 months ago, if I had seen this picture, I would have collapsed onto the floor. I would have hysterically screamed, completely lost my mind, and blindly begged whoever was listening to just take my life instead of hers. Gideon Blackwell was counting on exactly that reaction. Or he was banking his entire strategy on the assumption that under this new tactical gear, I was still just a fragile, highly emotional girl who would rush straight into a deadly ambush to save the person she loved. I felt the familiar, paralyzing spike of panic try to claw its way up my throat, but it hit a solid wall of ice. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly inhaled the cold air of the gym, letting the oxygen flood my brain, and I calmly handed the phone back to Victor. "Get the tactical team ready for immediate deployment," I said, my voice eerily flat. Victor blinked, clearly caught off guard by the absolute deadness in my eyes. "Miss Lena," he started, stepping forward, "it is a trap. The moment you walk into that warehouse, they will open fire." We need to wait for your mother to authorize a negotiation. I am not negotiating with a dead man, I snapped, my voice echoing violently off the concrete walls. I turned around and walked straight toward the armory. I was not walking blindly into a trap. I was walking into my own meticulously designed counteroffensive. Weeks ago, when I realized the true scale of the danger I was in, I knew my old life would eventually become leverage. I had quietly ordered my security detail to plant a microscopic GPS tracker inside the lining of Mia's everyday handbag. I already knew exactly which dockside depot they were holding her in. I had already memorized the architectural blueprints of the building, and I had mapped out 3 separate, highly secured extraction routes. I pulled a loaded magazine from the rack and slammed it into the grip of my weapon. The heavy metallic click felt like a heartbeat. People think that when you become cold, when you finally learn how to play this ruthless game, you lose your humanity. They think you stop feeling fear or love. But that is a complete lie. The burning rage and the terrifying fear do not magically disappear. They just stop controlling you. The emotions are still screaming inside your chest, but you are finally the one holding the leash. I strapped the tactical vest over my chest and looked at Victor, who was now staring at me with a profound, terrifying realization. "Let us go get my friend," I said quietly. The smell of rotting fish and rusted metal filled my lungs as I stepped out of the car. The dockside depot was completely dead, or hidden entirely in the shadows of massive shipping containers. I told Victor and the tactical team to hold their perimeter exactly 3 blocks away. If Gideon Blackwell saw a heavily armed convoy rolling up, he would put a bullet in Mia's head before I even reached the door. I had to walk into the slaughterhouse completely alone. I pushed the heavy corrugated steel door open. It shrieked loudly, echoing through the cavernous warehouse. The space was dimly lit by a single flickering halogen bulb hanging from the ceiling. Right in the center of the concrete floor was Mia. She was tied to a metal chair, her face bruised, her eyes wide as she saw me. Standing right behind her was a tall, heavily scarred man holding a silver pistol. Gideon. "Well, look at the little princess," Gideon said, his voice scraping against the walls like sandpaper. "And I really thought Catherine would send a small army. But she actually let you walk in here all by yourself to die for a friend. How pathetic." I kept my hands visible, taking slow, deliberate steps forward. I let my shoulders slouch just a fraction of an inch. I made my breathing shallow and rapid. I was giving him exactly what he wanted to see, a desperate girl who was way in over her head. "Please," I whispered. "I am here. You have me. Just let her go. She has absolutely nothing to do with this." Gideon laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He stepped away from Mia and walked toward me, spinning the pistol casually in his hand. He was so incredibly confident. He looked at me and saw the girl from the basement. He saw easy prey. But I was not looking at his gun. I was looking at his feet. His weight was heavily resting on his right heel, and his posture was sloppy. He was completely dropping his guard because he believed he was the only predator in the room. "Kick the chair away, turn around, and put your hands behind your back," Gideon barked, stepping within 2 feet of me. I did not hesitate for a single microsecond. The moment he reached out to grab my shoulder, I violently twisted my torso. I grabbed his extended wrist with both hands, using his own forward momentum to snap his arm downward. He let out a choked gasp of surprise. Before he could even register the pain, I drove my knee ruthlessly into his ribs, hearing a sickening crack. The silver pistol slipped from his fingers. I caught it in midair, smoothly stepped back, and aimed the barrel directly at the center of his forehead. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds. The heavy, metallic click of the safety being switched off echoed sharply in the silent warehouse. Gideon froze, his eyes bulging out of his skull. The arrogant smirk was completely wiped from his face, replaced by a pale, freezing stillness. Do not move a single muscle, I said, my voice completely steady. You little... He stammered, staring down the barrel of his own weapon. I did not flinch. My hands were perfectly steady. I kept my eyes completely locked onto his, counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Anyone can be forced into a nightmare. Anyone can be dragged into a dark, freezing cellar. But the fundamental difference between a victim and a controller has absolutely nothing to do with the environment. It is entirely about how you choose to step into that room. 6 months ago, Damien pushed me into a trap. Or when I broke down crying because I had no idea I was being hunted. Today I walked straight into a trap on purpose, because I was the one hunting. On the 4th second, the corrugated steel doors at the back of the warehouse violently exploded inward. Blinding tactical lights cut through the darkness. Victor and a dozen heavily armed men flooded the perimeter, their laser sights instantly locking onto Gideon's chest. "Drop to your knees!" Victor roared. Gideon slowly sank to the concrete floor, raising his hands, his eyes still locked on me. I slowly lowered the gun, my heart beating with a terrifying, rhythmic calm. I had just played my first hand in my mother's world, and I completely owned the board. The deafening noise of the extraction team finally faded into the cold night air, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thrum of our armored convoy. The dockside depot was completely secured. Gideon Blackwell was bleeding on the concrete floor, his entire syndicate dismantled in less than 20 minutes. I sat in the back of the heavy SUV, watching the estate medics carefully cut the thick plastic zip ties off Mia's bruised wrists. She was sobbing hysterically, shaking from the sheer, paralyzing terror of the last 48 hours. She lunged forward, grabbing the heavy fabric of my tactical vest, pulling me into a desperate, crushing hug. "Lena, I thought we were going to die in there," she sobbed, burying her face into my shoulder. I was so scared. I wrapped my arms around her, but my hands felt entirely numb. I felt the warmth of her tears soaking through my shirt, but my own eyes were completely, terrifyingly dry. My heart rate was a perfectly steady 60 beats per minute. While she was crying for her life, my brain was automatically scanning the dark shadows outside the tinted windows, evaluating the perimeter, calculating the exact distance to our extraction chopper. Mia slowly pulled back and looked at my face. She looked at the fresh blood smeared across my knuckles. She looked at the cold, heavy weapon strapped to my thigh. And then she looked directly into my eyes. She flinched. It was just a tiny, almost imperceptible shift in her posture. But I saw it. The pure, innocent girl she knew, the girl who used to spend hours laughing about bad dates and office politics over cheap wine, was completely gone. That girl had died on the freezing concrete floor of a European cellar 6 months ago. That is the cruelest lie they tell you about trauma and survival. People genuinely think that when you defeat the monster, when you finally break the chains and step back into the light, you get to go back home and be yourself again. But victory does not return your old self. It permanently burns your old identity to ashes. Surviving this ruthless world completely rewires your DNA. You do not just lose your innocence, you become a terrifying stranger to the people who love you the most. I gently wiped a tear from Mia's cheek, but I knew in that exact moment we would never belong to the same world ever again. The SUV suddenly lurched forward, accelerating toward the hilltop estate. Victor climbed into the seat across from me, his face grim. He did not say a word. He just handed me a black encrypted tablet they had recovered from a hidden safe inside Gideon's office. Our tech team had just broken through the primary firewall. I swiped the cracked screen, expecting to find a list of offshore bank accounts or shipping manifests. Instead, a single highly encrypted audio file appeared on the dashboard. I tapped the screen. It was Arthur. His smooth, chillingly aristocratic voice instantly filled the silent cabin of the vehicle. "If you are listening to this, Lena, it means you actually survived the warehouse. I must admit, I deeply underestimated your mother's brutal training regime, but do not confuse a single tactical victory with winning the war." The recording paused, accompanied by the faint, eerie sound of ice clinking against a glass. I gripped the tablet so hard my knuckles turned completely white. "You took out Gideon. You exposed my little side business. And you probably feel absolutely untouchable right now, sitting in your armored car. But a true parasite does not just infect a single limb, little bird. I was merely the architect of your European vacation. I am not the one who holds the master keys to the estate's internal security grid. Did you honestly believe I could manipulate the surveillance cameras, reroute the guard patrols, and blind your mother's intelligence network all by myself?" My blood instantly turned to ice. My lungs completely seized up. "Look much closer at the people standing right beside you, Lena." Arthur's voice whispered through the speakers. "The real poison is still in the water, and they are just patiently waiting for you to take a drink." The audio file suddenly corrupted and auto-deleted, leaving the dark cabin in a suffocating dead silence. I slowly looked up from the glowing screen. My eyes systematically swept over the armed guards sitting in the front seats, over the driver, over Victor. The terrifying reality crashed over me like a tidal wave. We had just won the battle, but the enemy was already inside the gates. The massive gold leaf doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a heavy, intimidating groan. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the silent, vibrating tension of absolute power. 200 of the most influential shareholders in the country sat in perfect, terrifying silence, their eyes like hawks, tracking my every movement as I walked down the center aisle. I was no longer wearing tactical gear. I was draped in a floor-length midnight blue gown, or my hair pulled back with surgical precision. But as I walked, I did not feel the soft silk against my skin. I felt the phantom weight of the tactical vest. I did not see a room full of businessmen. I saw a battlefield full of potential targets. My eyes automatically scanned the high balconies, the darkened corners, the subtle twitching of the security team's hands. My mother, Catherine Hart, stood at the marble podium, her presence radiating a chilling, absolute authority. She did not smile. She did not offer a hand to help me up the stairs. She simply stepped aside, her sharp gaze locking onto mine for a fraction of a second. It was not a look of maternal pride. It was a final, silent test. "Ladies and gentlemen." Catherine's voice cut through the room like a cold blade. 6 months ago. Do you question the stability of the Hart succession? You wondered if this empire would crumble because the next in line was soft. A low murmur rippled through the back of the room. I felt the collective weight of their judgment, their doubt, their greed. "Today that question is permanently answered," she continued, her voice dropping into a deadly low vibration. "I am officially announcing the appointment of Lena Hart as the executive chair of the board. She is no longer just an heir. She is the hand that will hold the blade." The room erupted into a storm of applause, but it felt entirely hollow. I looked out at the sea of smiling faces, at the men who were now bowing their heads to me, and I knew that half of them were already calculating how to destroy me. And I reached up and touched the silver griffin medallion resting against my throat. 6 months ago, this was just a piece of jewelry, a sentimental memory of a mother I never truly knew. It was a symbol of my innocence. But now, the silver felt heavy. It felt cold. It was no longer a memory. It was a massive, crushing responsibility. It was a badge of office in a world where a single mistake results in a shallow grave. Arthur's final warning echoed in the back of my mind. The real poison is still in the water. I stepped up to the podium and looked directly at the front row. I saw the board members who had conspired with Gideon. I saw the hidden traitors who thought I was still the naive girl from the cellar. I let a slow, predatory smile spread across my face. There's a popular myth that some betrayals are meant to destroy you, that they are designed to leave you broken in the dark. But the truth is far more interesting. Some betrayals do not destroy you. They serve as a violent, necessary rebirth. They strip away the soft, useless parts of your soul until the only thing left is the steel. They force you to become someone that the old, innocent version of you would not even recognize in a mirror. "I am Lena Hart," I said, my voice projecting with a terrifying absolute calm, "and the game is just beginning. If you learned something from my journey, or if you are ready to see how I dismantle the rest of the traitors, hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications, because in this world, the only thing more dangerous than an enemy you can see is the person you never expected to fight back."